Hi, everyone. We have a lot of presentations this morning, so I will try to be as quick as possible, not to bore you. And hopefully, after listening to all the honorable speakers, you'll be able to make your mind up on the directions of steel market. So we'll start with macroeconomics a little bit. First, I would like to say that there is absolutely nothing normal at the moment about the global economy, and there is nothing normal about steel market. The high hopes of V-shaped recovery in 2021 have been hurt by the inflation, high commodity, food and energy prices, and of course by the war in Ukraine. All this has caused slowdown in the global growth. It is expected that the global GDP will slow down in 2021 to 3.6% overall, from 6.1 in 2021. Slowdown will affect both advanced and emerging markets. In advanced economies, we expect that the growth will slow to about 3.3%, and emerging economies will slow down to 3.8%. If we have a look at the GDP projections on a country-by-country basis, European Union have been most affected by the increased energy prices. GDP in the European Union is expected to slow down from 4.6 to 2.8%. The influx of refugees from Ukraine is expected to put a lot of pressure on the social services in Europe as well. In the emerging Europe, war in Ukraine and subsequent sanctions will push GDP into minus from 4.9% in 2021 to minus 2.9% in 2022. Middle East and Africa are highly exposed to the increased food prices, but oil export revenues will allow these countries to offset those. That's why they're expected to grow by 4.6 and 3.8% respectively, which is not too bad actually. In the USA, huge COVID stimulus caused high inflation. Now Fed is tightening the monetary policy, which carry a risk of economic contraction. The growth is expected to go down to 3.7%. India actually is doing great, and India is expected to grow with about 8.2% in 2022. Developments in China continue dominating situation in Asia. This projection was published in April. It was expected that the Chinese GDP will reduce in 2022 from 8.1 to 4.4%. But the lockdowns continued until end of May, and most probably this number will have to be revised further down. It is rumored that in some provinces for Q2, there was actually recession, so the GDP was going down. And you know how Chinese government reacts to that. So looking at the inflation, you can see how high inflation is going everywhere in the world. War in Ukraine aggravated already high commodity prices. Energy and commodity prices pushed inflation up in Europe, and a small extent also in the United States. Rising energy and food prices also played major part in the inflation increases in the most emerging markets. During pandemic years, government spent a lot on stimulus programs. This has caused surge in demand for goods, while at the same time pandemic caused a lot of supply bottlenecks. As a result, the inflation surged to a 38-year high of 5.7% in the advanced economies and 8.7% in the developing economies. IMF is expecting inflation to slow down to 2.5 and 6.5% in 2023 respectively, based on the expectation of the government tightening monetary policies and also easing on the supply bottlenecks. But we will see what really actually going to happen. To illustrate a little bit the situation with backlogs and bottlenecks, one of the major causes of the inflation were supply bottlenecks. They started with COVID restrictions and were caused by the factories closures, port congestions, container shortages, and also labor supply issues. As you can see from this PMI index from Europe and the USA, backlogs and delivery times have slowed down to actually the lowest level in history. And this led to lower output in factories and higher inflation. This is just also to illustrate the cost of shipping. As you can see from during 2021, container freight index went up to $10,361 per box, which is basically about 5.5 times higher than normal. We all have suffered from that, and despite the fact that the container index is going down, the availability of containers and generally cargo vessels is restricted, and access to shipping remains a major unknown for the future. Okay, if we go to the construction sector overview, we only have data for the European construction sector, so I'll just quickly go through that. At the moment, construction is not doing too bad, actually going a little bit above the GDP levels. Looking at the country-by-country scenario from Euroconstruct, all the countries in Europe are doing great, especially Southern European countries. I suppose we are compensating for the shortage of construction in previous years. Germany is going really flat, so there is no growth in construction. Mainly it's explained by the high cost of input materials. So a lot of projects are very, let's say, they don't want to build if the raw materials go up so much. So they slow down a little bit. But again, because it affects the whole industry, we think it will speed up again in the second half of the year. Quickly looking at the world steel production, we saw that in 2021, there was a very reasonable growth in rebar production, but in 2022, we expect a slowdown. So as you can see in China, the consumption of steel is going to go down by about 32 million tons. It's been compensated by the consumption in all other major countries, but overall what will happen in 2022, we will see. If we look on the region by region scenario, unfortunately in 2022, we have seen a reduction in production. Overall, steel production decreased by about 6.8% in Q1 to 456 million tons. And if we look at the world, steel production decreased almost in every part of the world. Northern America has done very well with a reduction of only 0.9%, which is very little. And actually, as we will see in the next slide, at the top steel producing countries, on a country-by-country scenario, the best in 2022 is India with 5.9%. Of course, we all know about the introduction of the export tariffs in India recently, so we will see how they're going to do with that. But so far, they're doing great. As you can see, production in China dropped 10.5% in the first quarter of 22, but we'll talk about it a little bit later. Moving to demand, global steel demand, it's expected to decrease by about 2% in 2022, and it's expected to recover in 2023. The demand is dropping as a result of the war in Ukraine and lockdowns in China mainly. Okay, looking at the exports on China, as always, all the eyes are on China. Based on the experience of other countries recovering from COVID, it usually led to the explosion in demand. If China manages full recovery from COVID and lockdowns, and if they implement all the proposed policies, we should be able to see a very quick reverse of all trends and, I would say, explosive growth in demand. If we look at the export from China, it has been relatively low in this year, 2022, actually under the levels of 2021. So hopefully it will continue in this way. Huh? Okay. Moving to the loan product consumption. In 2021, we have seen a reasonably okay growth in consumption of loan products. But in 2022, we expect quite a big decrease. We expect global loan product consumption decrease by about 10%. And as you can guess, the drop in the consumption comes mainly from Asia, from China. If we have a look at the product by product, we can see that basically the decrease is expected in almost every product, different for different products, minus 15.5% for wire rods, minus 11% for rebars, merchant bars almost the same, minus 2.4%, and the section minus 7.5%. Okay, looking at the rebars. Looking at the rebars, we can see, if we look at the rebar consumption region per region, we'll see that the main, let's say, culprit of where the prices are dropping is China. The consumption in Asia is going to go down from 293 million tons to 245 million tons. We're going to lose about 48 million tons, and they are all coming from China. And you can see a very good illustration of that. This chart, the share of the Asian rebar consumption decreased from 64% in 2021 to 59% in 2022, and Chinese share will drop from 61 to 55% again. Okay. Looking at the price evolution of rebar, wire rod, and billet. A lot of things has happened since last IREPAS. One of the important factors was the energy price. In Europe, industrial consumers were forced to pay at some point up to 10-12 times more for energy than ever before. The most difficult part for steel mills is unpredictability. Price for electricity is set every day and can change at any time. And you cannot predict and you cannot secure yourself from that. The most important market development was the invasion of Ukraine, of course. Due to this and to the consequent sanctions on Russia and Belarus, international markets have lost access to about 10 million tons of loan products. Russia was supplying about 5.6, Ukraine and Belarus each 2.2 million tons, and approximately 10 million tons of semi-finished products. Of course, there is also raw material. Prices went up, as you can see, to the levels not seen before 2008, especially in the European Union. But slowly, Russian steel, especially billets, started trickling down to the countries that haven't imposed sanctions on Russia. Users agreed to buy these billets, but at a very steep discount. This has led to prices returning to the levels before the invasion and actually lower. Another factor that weakened the markets was a slowing down in China. It started last year in the property market. In 2021, Chinese government's zero-COVID policy led to prolonged lockdowns in major industrial centers. This in turn has caused a decline in steel consumption in China. Chinese government tried to balance it by reducing production. Overall, they have been successful, but the world's eyes are always on China, and a slowdown there caused customers everywhere to stop purchases. This is just to illustrate the impact of war in Ukraine on the world steel trade. Together, Russia and Ukraine account for approximately 13.5% of global steel exports. Russia is the second biggest exporter, and Ukraine is the ninth. Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus are very big loan product producers, exporters to the EU, and the EU is the most affected by all these developments. Russia exported approximately 5.6 million tons to the EU, Ukraine and Belarus approximately 2.2 million tons each. Together they account for about 27% of all EU loan product import. Looking at the reinforcing bar spread evolution, of course the major development was unusually high spread for rebar this year. And this basically can be explained by the uncertainty. In 2022, steel mills faced the situation of high uncertainty, unusual even for the steel market. Raw material prices can move up and down by 50% within weeks. Energy prices are decided on a day-by-day basis. Other raw materials for steelmaking also saw huge price swings due to the inflation, bottlenecks, and protectionism. This unpredictability in input costs, in general uncertainty, forces steel mills to maintain higher than usual margins. This explains recent price stickiness. Steel mills prefer reducing production to dropping prices. Why buy that last 10,000 tons of scrap at a high price, then pay a crazy rate for that extra electricity and then not being able to load it? In this current situation, the lower you produce, the better your bottom line would be. And as you can see, everyone is reducing production a little bit, in some countries more, in some countries less. And uncertainty drives up the margin for steel mills. It's a form of protection. To sum up the outlook for long products for 2021, the main factor, of course, is inflation. At the end of last year and the beginning of 2022, steel suppliers benefited from pent-up demand caused by the end of the pandemic. People wanted to buy durable goods and housing, but the supply side could not keep up with the demand. This has led to high inflation. What was thought in 2021 as transitionary inflation in 2022 turned out to be not so transitionary. Inflation has caused the real incomes to go down, pulling down the real demand as well. In order to address the fear of inflation, the governments and central banks are now turning the monetary policy 360 degrees, and are tightening money supply. Central banks in many countries are increasing the interest rates. The inflation pressure on one hand and the government tightening policies on the other hand will contribute to the high volatility in steel markets. Energy wars. Energy helped boost inflation last year with coal, oil and gas supplies tight amidst geopolitical uncertainty and after years of underinvestment. This was a main inflation driver in Europe and to a lesser extent in the United States. We are seeing now diesel shortages in the United States and prices going up. Decisions of some European countries to shut down coal and nuclear power plants exacerbated the costs and the crisis. There seemed to be no quick solution in sight for the energy crisis. Long-term high energy prices are almost certain now. The EU and Russia are entering into some form of energy, don't want to say war struggle, let's say. Some European countries are being cut off gas supply, while at the same time European Union is considering oil and gas embargo on Russia. Developing countries may have an opportunity to buy cheap Russian oil and gas, but it depends on the possible secondary sanctions on Russian energy, and also it depends on how quickly China will recover from the pandemic. Again, unpredictability is in play here. The good news is that the world economy is much less oil dependent than before. It takes now 3.5 times less oil to produce 1 million in the world GDP than it did in 1970s. So the energy shocks are affecting the economy, but they're not destroying it. The war and sanctions on Russia and Belarus will have important consequences for the steel industry. After the invasion, steel prices went to the levels not seen since 2008. Now, 3 months afterwards, prices came back to the pre-war levels. Even if the increases were probably too much, because so many tons have been taken out of the market effectively, the current level of prices is too low and is not sustainable. Also, you have to take into consideration that war means physical destruction of infrastructure and, the military equipment. And that means arms race, and that means steel demand. This factor will probably come into fold in the second half of this year or probably beginning of the next year, but it will definitely be a factor, a very important one. Situation with sanctions continue to develop, and this adds yet another level of confusion. You have to bear in mind that many people don't realize that there is also a thing of the secondary sanctions. when, for example, a major car manufacturers, they require all their suppliers to comply with sanctions. So even if you're a steel mill who produces wire rod and you want to use cheap billet, you may not be able to because the drawer that buys wire rod from you will require you to reconfirm that you are not using sanctioned product. Another factor will be, of course, China's stimulus. In order to counterbalance the negative effects of the prolonged lockdowns, Chinese government announced a massive $5 trillion investment program to boost the supply side of the economy, to support the companies, and to boost the infrastructure spending. It's great for the steel industry, and it's great for all of us. The previous stimulus programs in China led to the strong revival in the steel industry all over the world. It is actually the opposite of what the USA government did. USA government boosted the demand when the supply side was suffering from raw material shortages and supply bottlenecks. The infrastructure part of the USA Build Back Better bill failed in Congress. It's, of course, that caused inflation. China is supporting actually the supply side, which usually helps steel industry. Another factor we should talk about is that the pandemic policy and vaccine access, they continue affecting the market. Worker shortages and mobility restriction compounded supply disruptions and bottlenecks in 2021, 2022. Recently, combination of low vaccination, high transmissible variants, and zero COVID policy led to what feels like unending lockdowns in China. New variants should also be considered a risk for the autumn of 2022. Pandemic has not finished yet. Looking at to sum up, we are talking about the unprecedented economic situation in 2021. We discussed this at the last IREPAS, that the current economic situation is very complicated and unprecedented. There are many forces pulling world economy in different directions. Western governments always stimulated the demand and cause high inflation. Chinese government is going to stimulate the supply side while ignoring the consumption. Inflation is scary, but government reaction to the inflation can be even more scary as it can cause recession. Steel mills are struggling to adjust to the ever-changing energy prices. There is no sign for any stability at site. International spillovers from war in Ukraine via global commodity and food prices, financial connections through humanitarian impacts will spread the effects all over the world. The good news is that the COVID wave is subsiding in China. In other countries, post-COVID revival led to the explosive growth in the demand for consumer goods and housing. It's reasonable to expect the same in China. In addition, in 2021, Chinese government is planning this huge stimulus. Combined with the post-COVID recovery, we have all the chance reversing the recession and create a wave of demand that we need so much in the steel industry. And to complete this presentation, there is a curse in the Chinese language. May you live in interesting times. These are indeed the interesting times, and I wonder if anyone cursed all of us. That's it. And this is just a little bit of an illustration of the Chinese stimulus. Okay. Thank you very much for your attention.
Alex. As you have mentioned, we have a packed program, packed agenda, but perhaps we may have a couple of questions if you allow us. Are there any questions from the floor? Can we have the microphone?
It was a great presentation, Alex, as always. Thank you. I just wondered, I have noticed something on the upper right corner of your slide saying that we are a recycling company, #1 in Spain and #2 in Europe. So I wonder, what has really motivated you to define yourself as a recycling company rather than a steel maker?
We believe that we're entering a new world of sustainability and a circular economy. So what we are trying to do, being electric arc furnace, we already recycle a lot, but we are trying to increase that to levels probably have not seen before. So we believe that it's very important for all of us to understand that sustainability will be driving a lot of things. There is a big drive at the moment in many countries to introduce new standards for steel consumption and new standards for steel mills, which will take into consideration how sustainable we are and how sustainable steel is. We will all have to learn what a EPD is, what is cradle-to-cradle recycling and all those things. It's all coming to us. And it's coming not just to us, but it's coming to our customers as well. There is a lot of talk of introduction of some kind of green rating system for construction projects. And we will all have to comply with that in the future.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
Thank you very much. Hello,
Hi.
my name is Burak from Kalanish Commodities. I have a question. Among the listed countries' GDP growth, what is your expectation for Turkey for 2022 GDP growth rate?
I wish I knew. Unfortunately, I'm sorry, I'm not a specialist on Turkey. We're going to have a very nice presentation on the Turkish economy next, and I think we will all hear about that.
Okay, if you don't mind, I have a second question.
Sure.
we had Iran before having been sanctioned on the steel products, so they were able to offer to different markets very cheap, low-tech products. Now we've got Russia, and you said that they're disturbing the market. How viable is this?
Well, it's very simple. Not all the countries in the world impose sanctions on Russia. If you haven't imposed sanctions on Russia, then of course you can buy steel products from Russia. And this will continue, and theoretically it should lead to two-tier pricing in the market. Unfortunately, because all the markets, they are like connected vessels. So if you have low price here, eventually it will lead to lower prices everywhere. So when Russian suppliers, they keep producing steel. They may be reducing production a little bit now, but they are rolling and they need to export. And if they find a cheap sale somewhere, this will eventually lead to prices reducing for everyone everywhere. Even if, for example, in Europe, we are not using Russian steel. If Russian billet is arriving to, let's say, Egypt, an Egyptian manufacturer after that produces rebars and wire rods and sells them to Europe, indirectly, it will affect everyone. And that's the reason why prices went down in April and May.
But Europe hasn't sanctioned Russian semis, right?
Europe has not sanctioned Russian semis, but the sales of Russian semis to Europe was negligible.
Okay, in that case, any Russian semis would be converted into a finished product, can be sold into Europe, and there will
Correct.
be an imbalance, right?
Correct.
Thank you.
And that's why I mentioned the secondary sanctions, and they are on the way as well. So when, for example, you would have to prove that the steel that you are selling to Europe, none of it would come from the sanctioned country.
Thank you very much.
But it's not in place yet.
Thank you very much, Alex.
Thank you.